This is the Water and Water Relatives session. We are very excited to have you join us today. We have a great group of folks who are going to share some of their knowledge and experience with us today and invite you all into a discussion. Really thinking about, the social, political, economic, or technical mechanisms to protect water and water relatives in an era of global change. Again, very excited. So without further ado, I'm going to start with our first speaker. And forgot to introduce myself. My name is Olivia, LeDee. I'll be the moderator today. I'm the acting director for the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And again, we're focusing on mechanisms to protect water and water relatives in an era of climate change. So our first speaker is Professor Aimee Kraft from the University of Ottawa. She's associate professor at the Faculty of Common Law and an adjunct professor at law at the University of Manitoba. She's an expert in Anishinaabe and Canadian Aboriginal law. She prioritizes Indigenous-led and interdisciplinary research, including visual arts and film, co-leads a series of major research grants on decolonizing water governance, and works with many Indigenous nations and communities' Indigenous relationships with and responsibilities to water. She plays an active role in international collaborations related to transformative memory in colonial contexts and relating to the reclamation of Indigenous birthing practices as expressions of territorial sovereignty. So welcome, Aimee.
Thank you, Olivia. Bonjour, nidimi magnenduk. Kiwin nino dini kwe ndishnakas miknaki kwe ndishnakas mangana ndodem. Into api donji Anishinaabe Koyandao. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to speak on this panel and on this topic with our relatives here, and to follow the wonderful keynote that we had this morning by Dr. Kimmerer. I think the stage has been set for the idea that we need to listen to land, we need to listen to our relatives, and that there's an imperative for systems change. That's really a strong key message from this morning. And so what I wanted to think about in relation to that is the idea of jurisdiction or responsibility. A lot of legal systems are set up around jurisdiction as ownership. And I think when we engage in the water conversation, we need to flip that. When we engage in Indigenous context, we need to think about our responsibilities, because that's the way our Indigenous legal structures have been formed around the idea of responsibilities. And I think what's worth mentioning too is this morning we heard a lot about land and the connection of land to water. But I want to suggest that those two jurisdictions have a compression in ways that laws kind of tend to make us think in binaries, so land or water, or things that are separate as categories. It's funny, in Canadian constitutional law, there's a principle about watertight compartments and these jurisdictions being separate from one another, but thinking about how they connect through principles like cooperation in a federal state. And so when I think about jurisdiction relating to land and water, I actually connect the two through Anishinaabe perspectives, and use treaties as an example of ways in which women affirm their jurisdiction in relation to water and land. And I think that there are different ways of thinking about that amongst different Indigenous nations. I know that our Cree relatives will talk about aski, so land as a concept that embodies water. But in Anishinaabe worldviews and in Anishinaabe law, we separate them out and compress them at the same time. And that becomes a very complex and interesting dance in terms of understanding responsibility and jurisdiction. So I have a couple of slides that I'm going to attempt to share here. And we'll see if it works. All right. So the first thing I wanted to express is that this is where I'm from. So I see myself as belonging not only to land, but also to the waters of our territory. And I define my jurisdiction mostly by the watershed that I belong to. So thinking about how we reframe geopolitical jurisdictions. So the idea of where our laws apply, who they apply to, and about what, into Indigenous views that actually speak to an obligation and responsibility and belonging to territory. So this is the territory that I belong to. This is on the right-hand side where you see the Winnipeg River flowing into Lake Winnipeg, and that's my home territory. You can see it represented on this map as well. And this is the whole of the watershed, which actually links us as relations not only to different parts of this territory, but also different Indigenous nations. And my great aspiration is that we actually further enhance our collaboration with our Cree and Blackfoot relatives to the west, and as well as our relatives to the south, so that we can work out systems of water governance that are more effective and reflective of our Indigenous legal orders. And why is this key? Well, I think we're in a context where we're seeing the confrontation between Western legal systems and Indigenous legal orders, both which have their legitimacies, but thinking about them as potentially coming into conflict and finding ways to resolve that conflict, or to think about maybe the use of Indigenous legal orders as potentially more aligned with ideas of benefit and well-being of the earth and water. So water protectors enacting Indigenous laws, state laws, kind of preserving the capitalist interest, but thinking about where are spaces where we can reconcile those or shift from a dominant narrative of Western colonial capitalist perspectives into Indigenous legal values. And we have sets of principles that are associated to our Indigenous legal orders. We recognize that water has a spirit, that we can't own it, that it's life, it can heal. And then we have these accompanying responsibilities to care for it in ways that recognizes its duality and the fact that it can suffer. So we know it can give life, but it can take life. And so that makes this relationship with Nibe, we call it an Anishinaabe one, a very sacred one, and one that has a long history of being developed and thought through carefully over time. And that's where I think women's jurisdiction is so important. And I know that Sue is going to talk about that a little bit later. So some of the work that we've done in assembling on land and territory has helped us understand this fundamental difference and what I think causes that jurisdictional conflict that we saw illustrated in the images of Standing Rock. And what we're dealing with are two different sets of competing values that underlie our legal systems. So from the Anishinaabe perspective, actually I'm going to start with the Western perspective that's on the right-hand side. Western law is structured around individual rights and the protection of private property for the most part. And often it's bilateral. So I have a right, someone has an obligation in relation to me as a rights holder. Flip that and contrast that with what's on the left of the screen, which is Inakanagewan or Anishinaabe Inakanagewan, that's centered around relationships and the idea of collective well-being. So we have, right at the core or in the pillars of the structure of law, very different objectives. One is relational, based on collective well-being, and the other is looking at the protection of rights of individuals and private property. And in this structure of relationships, we can see that that idea of bilateral relationships of obligations and rights is thrown out the window. We have all of these corresponding responsibilities to each other, to one another, in this complex web of relationships that's ongoing in time and fluctuates. So there, you can imagine how many different sets of relationships exist. And this is just a small representation of those. How we understand them is through these sacred laws, spiritual laws that we've been given, what we've observed over time through how other beings as part of nature have interacted with each other. We've looked to our ancestors who've developed principles over time to align our legal orders with what we've learned from both these sacred and spiritual instructions and through nature. And then when we're dealing with particular human contexts, then we get into human and deliberative lawmaking. And what's interesting is if you think about Western legal systems, they structure it differently. They place human deliberation right at the core, at the center of legal systems. And as Indigenous people, we don't do that. And I think that's why it's important to recognize that internationally, this idea of the distinct spiritual relationship that we have with our waters is a right. And we have a right to also uphold this responsibility for future generations. And that's confirmed in the UN DRIP at Article 25. It's also confirmed in our own mechanisms. So this is a Nibé Declaration issued by Grand Council Treaty 3 that illustrates some of the principles and responsibilities that we have in relation to the watershed within Treaty 3. I think there's an important accompanying question to all of this, and I know we'll get into it in the discussion a little bit later once everyone's had a chance to share thoughts, but I think we need to take seriously this question, is water a person? Is it a being? What does that mean in law? What does it mean in Western legal systems and Indigenous laws? Is this the right way to recognize spiritedness and agency? And we've seen this done around the world in terms of recognizing the rights of nature and the rights of particular water bodies and recognizing its personhood. And there are some different mechanisms by which we do that. So legislation, cases, constitutional recognitions, citizens' approaches, and then we have Indigenous mechanisms that bring that forward as well. And there are some key examples, I think, more recently of Indigenous nations making these assertions through resolutions or declarations and bilateral agreements that connect to acts of different governments in collaboration for the recognition of personhood. And one of the questions that I have in closing is, is this the right mechanism? Do we give effect to our jurisdiction in recognizing personhood, or are there other mechanisms that can help us better understand those responsibilities and then give effect to them as beings that are in interaction and have responsibilities to Nibé and that whole web of beings that exists in relation to it? So I'll leave it at that. I look forward to hearing from our co-panelists, and thank you again for your time and the invitation to be part of this conversation. Miigwech.
Thank you so much. A perfect setup because we are left with so many questions and interest in discussion. Well, thank you. So our next presentation is from Ms. Sue Chiblow. Sue is Crane Clan born and raised in Garden River First Nation. She has worked extensively with First Nation communities for the last 30 years in environmental related fields. Sue has her Bachelor's of Science degree with a minor in chemistry and her master's degree in environment and management. Sue is a PhD candidate at York University with a focus on our knowledge of water, exploring humanity's relationship to water and how improving this relationship can support its well-being and for that of all life. She's the recipient of the Vanier Graduate Scholarship and is in the Predoctoral Fellowship in American Indian and Indigenous Studies program at Michigan State University. Sue has participated in water walks, water ceremonies, and water gatherings, learning the responsibilities to waters. She's worked extensively with First Nation peoples and is a volunteer for the Traditional Ecological Knowledge Elders of the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory. So, welcome.
Thank you. Anin bojo suchiblo dishnikaz, ogama nag indigo, jajak doram, ketaganzi bi dunjba, manishnabe koyen dao, and ketaganzi bi inda nogum. So my name is Chiblow. I'm from Garden River, where I also live. I first want to thank you for inviting me to share knowledge that I've gained from many, many people, primarily Anishinaabe people, and also too from knowledge that I've gained from the water and from the land and participating in ceremonies. So I will be presenting from strictly an Anishinaabe perspective because that's who I am. I am also a daughter, a sister, a mother, and a grandmother, and I am a water carrier as a woman. So I'm going to share my screen because I have a couple slides, but while I'm doing that, I wanted to acknowledge Robin's presentation today and how she talked about our moral responsibilities to the land, but also furthering that into our moral responsibilities to water. And a lot of Anishinaabe people, when they say the lands, that's inclusive of all of our relatives. It's inclusive of the water, but also too mentioning the star world and how we interact and have responsibilities with the star world. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about Anishinaabe Gikendaswin Min, and Gikendaswin means our knowledge. It's not my knowledge, it's ours, and focusing specifically on women because women have a specific responsibility to the water as carriers of the water. So in terms of governance, like Aimee had explained, I too am from the Treaty Robinson here on treaty territory in the yellow, and my little reserve box here is down in the red, right beside Sault Ste. Marie along the St. Mary's River. And in the bigger scheme of things, this is the territory that governs me. These are the waters that govern me. This is where my ancestors have lived for thousands and thousands of years. These are the lands that I'm connected to, and these are the waters that I'm connected to. So in terms of Anishinaabe Gikendaswin Min, our knowledge, spirit comes first in everything that we do. Acknowledging that spirit, the spirit of the water, and understanding that the water has its own responsibilities. It was given its responsibilities from Creator, and how we have that relationship through those responsibilities as women, because women carry that first environment. We carry that water lodge where children are carried, and also the water brings forth life through the women, typically, not always, but normally paving the path, cleansing that path so that the child can be born. And the image of the moon, and remembering that, I think Robin also talked about how the moon is our grandmother. We refer to her as Nokomis Gizus, and she's our grandmother and she's our teacher, but she has a special relationship with women. She has a 28-day cycle, and so do women. So we have that special relationship with the moon in terms of having that responsibility, and in terms of having what we call full moon ceremonies. Also too, in this bottom image is of the Garden River, to which I'm also connected to, and it's in our territory, and how water continuously flows. Water lives its responsibilities without us interrupting it, and how it will continue to govern itself as long as humans quit interfering with these waters. So in terms of looking at Kino Gigo Nadawasin, which means everything is connected, and how we are connected to these waters and to the lands. And I walk frequently in and among some trees, and one day I was walking in there and thinking about how everything is connected. And I had put in my sema down, just giving gratitude for those trees, because maple syrup time was coming, the shelter that they provide. I was watching how the winds were making the branches dance. And when I put my sema down, I sat down and I was thinking about this, on how everything is connected. And what I was shown is how the water moves through our bodies, how we intake the water, and then how we put it back into the system, and how that's been going on for thousands of years. So our ancestors' waters have gone through the same process as humans, and how we are actually connected to the trees, because the trees take up that water, the plants take up that water, the animals take up the water. And it was actually showing me on how we're all connected through water, regardless of race or any type of background. As human beings, we're connected to everything through the water. And as our bodies are made up of 70% water, this also helps us connect on looking at that water that comes from the trees, the water that comes from the lands, and how we are in relationship. We are actually truly, like how Robin had explained, we are actually truly a relative, because we're all connected. So in terms of our women's responsibilities, women carry that birth water, so that sacred water lodge. And so we have a voice for the water. There are 4 different types of waters. There's the salt water, the woman's water, the birthing water, the fresh water, and the sky waters. And thinking about our responsibilities to all of those 4 different waters through the responsibility of carrying healthy water and being healthy. And in doing so, acknowledging that duality that the water has and offering that respect to the water. So this is one image of myself and Jay Baugh Redbird, who was assisted me in carrying the water. He carried the staff, and we came. This was one of the water walks that I participated in. It was called the Mother Earth Water Walk because we converged the 4 waters from the 4 different directions and brought those waters together. And we walked from, we commissioned the water from Hudson Bay, and we walked, well, we came down on a train to Winnipeg, and then from Winnipeg, we walked down to Bad River, Wisconsin, carrying the water. And we brought the waters together to ceremony and brought them out into a spot on Lake Superior that our ancestors knew have a connection on how the waters go out to all of Turtle Island. So Turtle Island is North America, Canada, US, and Mexico. And they knew that there was a spot there that connects these waters to everything, and showing how we're actually connected to the whole of Turtle Island when we're actually living in one particular place. And so we did that ceremony, and then also looking at how water brings forth life and how creation never stops. Water typically doesn't stop, and how we can actually be the water, considering that we're made up of 70% water, that how we can actually walk or move like the water, in terms of if we run into an obstacle, and if you're watching the water continues to flow, it'll figure out how to go over top or around. And so having that, those teachings and remembering those teachings, connecting to the water to gain those teachings. And I think it's really important that, you know, we need to remember our history, we need to remember our teachings, and this is what helps us move forward, and how we can actually change some of the worldviews that are out there, and understanding that all life needs water. If humans were to disappear from this planet, life would continue to strive probably a lot better than it is right now, considering all the environmental destruction that's happening or has happened. So just remembering that, you know, as humans, we are the baby of creation, and everything else are our teachers. And Jim Dumont, he talks about Indigenous intelligence, and which means the listening with the spirit, seeing with the spirit, participating in spirit, and spirit experiences everything first. And as a human being, we all have a spirit inside of us, and our physical vessels are just carrying that spirit through this walk of life in order to connect, in order to experience what it needs to experience. And so Jim Dumont talks about this as a way of seeing, a way of knowing, a way of thinking, and an actual way of being. And he relates it to the heart, to the spirit, to the heart, and to the mind, and to the physical. And one of the reasons why I mentioned this is because of that responsibility that we have in relation to water, to actually doing something, to take action. Somebody coined the term reconciliation. It's not just about talking about it. We actually have to do something, and there are many ways that we can do these actions, right? So just wanted to share a little bit of that with you, and wanted to thank you for inviting me to participate with these very brilliant women on this panel. Miigwech.
Thank you very much. Yes, very exciting. So keep us moving so that we can get going to our discussion. Our next speaker is Dr. Kelsey Leonard. She's a water scientist, legal scholar, and policy expert, writer, and enrolled citizen of the Shinnecock Nation. Dr. Leonard received a master's in science and water science, policy and management from the University of Oxford, a JD from Duquesne University and a PhD in political science from McMaster University. Her work focuses on Indigenous water, justice, and climatic, territorial, and governance underpinnings for our shared sustainable future. She represents the Shinnecock Indian Nation on the Mid-Atlantic Committee on the Ocean, which is charged with protecting America's ocean ecosystems and coastlines. Welcome.
Quay, hello, wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I am just so thrilled to be a part of this larger conversation with these wonderful panelists. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully folks are now seeing that, which should be great.
Yep, all set.
Okay, wonderful. So thanks so much. So I think it's really great the way in which we kind of set this up. It was somewhat planned, but not so much. And so I'm going to be talking about sort of our salt waters, as Sue was mentioning, and thinking about our ocean and coastal water protectors, which is very near and dear to my heart, being from a coastal First Nation. So where am I from? So I'm from the Shinnecock Nation. I'm an enrolled citizen. Our territory is located on the southern shores of what we call Paumanok, but what is currently known today as Long Island, New York, as you can see here. This map is actually somewhat abbreviated in the sense that what you're seeing here is the east end, or sort of the eastern portion of Paumanok, Long Island, which is our traditional territory as Shinnecock peoples. And so we are fishermen and baymen and whalers originally. And so we have this innate connection to water, and in particular, where our territory sits is where freshwater meets saltwater. So I also, in our language, Shinnecock means people of the shore. So I often think of us as shore protectors, or at least our ancestors thought of us as that. So some folks may be familiar, and Dr. Kraft mentioned this earlier in regards to personhood and recognition of the inherent rights of water. I have a TED Talk that speaks to that. If you are interested in taking a look at it, I put it into the chat box. I won't be speaking too much to that today, but maybe in our question and answer session. So what am I going to speak with you about today? Well, I wanted to reflect a little bit on what is water science, but particularly water science from a Shinnecock perspective. So when we think about water science governance, what does water justice look like for future generations? It's about protecting, our inherent rights for aquaculture cultivation, for fishing, for protection of our heritage sites. Also thinking about, how do we protect our ceremonial practices, including our canoe journeys and other ceremonies that are connected directly to water. And how do we protect that also in light of climate change? So that's a bit of where I'm going to narrow my focus today in some of the comments that I'll be sharing with you. So you may have heard of wampum before, because in this part of the world where many of us are zooming in from in terms of the Great Lakes, it really does constitute a lot of our treaty relationships and our understanding of governance through our wampum belts. But what many folks don't know or don't really understand is the life cycle of wampum. It is actually harvested from eastern coastal Atlantic waters. And depending on where you harvest your wampum from, it's actually dependent on the types of coloring that you're going to get based out of the shells. And so wampum is made from shells, quahog as well as whelk shells. So you can kind of see that here. You have to dig for it. They are embedded in sort of the seabed and estuary and bay system. So kind of this image down here at the bottom, those are quahogs that have been dug with your, what we call clam diggers, which are actually, I'm showing my hands, but it's your feet. There are some more advanced tools that we have as well that we've developed as Indigenous peoples over the years. But you harvest them, you have to bring them back. We use everything as a part of those quahogs. We eat the quahogs, and then we harvest the shells, and they are carved into what you may know as wampum beads that make our contemporary, as well as historical wampum belts that form our treaty relationships. So I share this with you because it really forms is formative in how I understand my relationship to water, and also the way in which I think as Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, we understand our relationship to water and connection to one another, both through diplomatic relationships as constituted by wampum, but also the physical way in which we connect to water and to those more than human relations that exist in these ecosystems. So it also shows us how we are connected across borders. And I love to share this quote by Ban Ki-moon, who says that climate change does not respect borders. It does not respect who you are, rich and poor, small and big. Therefore, this is what we call global challenges, which require global solidarity. I personally think that as Indigenous peoples and nations, we know this really well in terms of how we've been able to build a global solidarity amongst each other and our nations for millennia, but also, in large part due to colonization, now being able to start to reconstitute some of those traditional kinship networks. So when we think about climate change and we think about water, particularly rising sea levels, it's a really big challenge, particularly for Indigenous nations along the Eastern Atlantic, like my nation, Shinnecock. So this is Shinnecock, our main territory that we call the Neck. This is us currently, but with anticipated modeling projections of sea level rise by 2050 and then to 2100, we could see sea level rise that inundates or floods our land that looks like this. So the red is what we will likely see by 2050, and the yellow is sort of the max projection by 2100. But unfortunately, these numbers keep getting worse in terms of the modeling predictions of sea level rise. So we may see, under a worst case scenario by 2100, a loss of about half of our existing reserve or reservation lands. And that's really important for us to understand as tribal nations and First Nations, because we are, as Dr. Kraft mentioned earlier, we're sort of confined within these jurisdictions by colonial legal systems that have placed us within fixed boundaries. But climate change doesn't respect those boundaries. And as we start to think about how do we adapt and how do we potentially relocate and move, we're going to have to, as a larger we collective society, reconcile with colonization and with these fixed boundaries and allow for more mobility and adaptation of communities. So in doing that, that's where I developed this new publication. I'll put the link into the chat box because, recognizing time, I won't have the opportunity to go into massive detail about the publication, but it really is setting up a framework for our Indigenous coastal communities along the Eastern Atlantic to adapt to rising sea level and to really think about how we reconstitute that relationship with water in light of the climate crisis. And so for those that may not be familiar, these are some of our federally recognized tribal nations throughout the Eastern and Mid-Atlantic regions. Shout out to Northeast Climate Science Center for the work that they've been doing with tribes in building this map, and there's some more mapping work that they're going to be doing to update this as well. So that was the geographic scope of the study, was really looking at Eastern coastal tribes. As I mentioned before, by 2050, the modeling projections are showing that we will likely have a rise under, of 2 feet of rise along the Atlantic coast, and that's sort of under moderate emissions. As we know with the Paris Agreement and with sort of some of the reporting that is coming out, we are not meeting that moderate emissions likelihood rise. We are sort of in the higher end, so that likely is going to push us to more than 2.6 feet, and with the potential sort of high end spectrum being close to 7 feet of sea level rise along the Eastern Atlantic coast. That includes both the United States and Canada, for those trying to have a point of reference. So what does that mean for our tribal nations? It could be increased flooding, permanent inundation or loss of lands, as I mentioned. We also have concerns around saltwater intrusion leading to drinking water contamination, because many tribal nations and First Nations along the Eastern Atlantic, we use well water for our drinking water. And so there's a potential threat of inundation of those well water systems, and then also impacts to cultural resources and displacement. So what do we do? Well, usually when we think about sea level rise, we look to sea level rise SLR adaptation frameworks. And so when I was looking to see what types of adaptation frameworks were available to tribes and First Nations, probably unshockingly, there weren't any. So it was really important for me to try and think through what would an SLR adaptation framework look like for Eastern Atlantic tribes like my own. And here are some of the ones that were out there in the world. They, obviously sort of have this Western framework put towards them. Additionally, this one on the left is from the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they literally call it the generic adaptation framework. And if we want our solutions to be localized, we really need for our adaptation frameworks to be localized and context specific. You can see here, the terminology is about planned retreat, so moving away from water, accommodate, moving up from water to accommodate for sea level rise, and then also protect, which is building out hard defenses. And there's a new one that's called attack, which is reclaiming land from the seabed and developing on it. So what I noticed and what others have noticed, both Marino and Hardy, other scholars in this space, is that there's kind of this air of adaptation oppression, as Marino calls it, or colorblind adaptation planning, where all of the adaptation frameworks that are being developed to think about how we fulfill that responsibility to water are really written from a Western perspective and don't take other cultures and communities into consideration. So it has this like militarized combative language. There's not a lot of cultural connections. There's no Indigenous design. It's very human-centric. So in all of these ways, it's like, how are our communities, Indigenous people, supposed to adapt to sea level rise with something that doesn't speak to them, doesn't really respond to our unique cultural histories and practices? So as I close out, I'll just share that we created a wampum adaptation framework. And so it's a sea level rise adaptation framework built off of what I shared with you earlier about wampum, which is integral to our Eastern coastal communities. And it's an acronym that stands for WITNESS, which is witness warnings from human and non-human relations and follow the patterns of the natural world. Acknowledge, which is to acknowledge traditional teachings and restore cultural stewardship practices. MEND, which stands for mend the shoreline and practice healing for coastal and environmental sovereignty. Protect, which stands for protect future generations by protecting cultural sites and ancestors. Unite, which stands for unite with other communities to build capacity, plan relocation. And the last one is move, which is move to new places, but particularly those places that still have that cultural connection for us and allow us to rebuild. So I will stop there, and thanks so much for allowing me to share a little bit of our research and community with you. I think you might be on mute, Olivia.
Thank you, Kelsey. I sure was. I was just saying what a wonderful image to leave us with. Our next presenter is Dr. Abagail Lynch. She's a research fish biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey's National Climate Adaptation Science Center and serves as the coordinator for the International Fish Research Network and steward for the Fish and Climate Change Database. Abby received her PhD in Fisheries and Wildlife from Michigan State University on perceptions of management and climate impacts to Great Lakes whitefish in the 1836 treaty waters of Lakes Huron, Michigan, and Superior, and her MS in Marine Science on Atlantic Manhattan Population Genetics at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science and College of William and Mary. Abby conducts science and science synthesis to address impacts of global change on inland and hydrogenous fishes at local, national, and global scales to inform adaptive management and sustainable use. Welcome, Abby.
Thanks, Olivia. And just to confirm, everyone can see my slide. I'm sharing the right screen.
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, first, I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to be with you today, and it's an honor to be on this panel with the other illustrious panelists. As Olivia mentioned, my name is Abagail Lynch, and I'm a research fish biologist with the USGS National Climate Adaptation Science Center, and I'm speaking to you today from Virginia, which is not far from where this photo was taken at Great Falls on the Potomac River And I just want to begin by acknowledging that the Piscataway and Anacostia people have resided in this region and served as stewards of the local land and waterways for generations and generations. And their people continue to thrive in this region and honor and celebrate their culture and relationship with water and land. And I, let's see here. So when Olivia approached me for the panel, she presented it to me as the panel session in the form of this, what's called a PEST analysis, and where PEST is an acronym for political, economic, social, and technological, and framing it so that I'm the last in this suite of talks. And so we'll applying this tool kind of to look at the effects of climate change on water and water relatives. And so today, what my position in the panel being this final kind of science and technology component, which I think follows well from the first three speakers. And but I want to also acknowledge that I am not Indigenous, and I'm speaking from an upbringing in Western science tradition as a fisheries biologist. So I want to begin by acknowledging that I recognize that there are many ways of knowing and that can very much contribute to this discussion. And it's my hope that what I share today serves as a respectful dialogue fostered with the other presenters and all of the participants in the session, where we can kind of help weave together both Indigenous knowledge and Western science to help meet these challenges of water and water relatives within a changing climate. And I want to apologize if I do end up falling back on kind of Western science vernacular. I'm very much still learning, so please, I welcome you to correct me and let me know so that I can improve. As a basic preface for the remainder of my time, because I am a fish biologist, I will be talking from the lens of fisheries and fisheries science and management. But in many ways, I view fish as kind of the analogy of an aquatic canary in the coal mine, where with regards to water resource management and kind of the broader discussion we're having today. Thinking holistically, what's good for the fish is good for the systems, and what's good for the systems are good for people. And just as a side note, this photo was taken of me when I was in graduate school at Michigan State University, and it was taken on a boat that was through the Chippewa Ottawa Resource Authority. They were very welcoming and allowed me to come out sampling with them because I was using lake whitefish data to model potential changes as a result of climate change on lake whitefish recruitment in the 1836 treaty waters for my graduate research. And this work collaborated with the 5 Upper Great Lakes tribes, so the Bay Mills Indian Community, the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians, the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, the Little Traverse Bay Band and the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. So they're all collectively managed by Cora. And I just want to mention that I'm grateful for the opportunity to work with everyone on that project when I was in school. And so getting back to thinking on kind of science and science technology, for better or worse, in fishery science at least, we've really focused on technological solutions. If we lose a population of fish, we can restock another, for example, or if we have trouble harvesting, we can make improvements to gear, or if we block migration of certain fish, we can try to create fish passage. All of that thinking, what really happens with climate change, and generally for aquatic habitat in the Great Lakes region, for example, we can expect that we are going to get a warmer, wetter, windier kind of climate with less ice cover and less dissolved oxygen. And how that translates to fish habitat is not entirely clear, but we will expect shifts to warmer water fish assemblages. And in some cases, there may even be increases in optimal thermal habitat, even for cool and cold water fishes. And additionally, with increasing temperatures, there may be increases in primary production, which could potentially have positive implications to the food chain. So the impacts on fish and fisheries are not really black and white, and there isn't really an issue that you can kind of readily technologize our way around, especially because the root causes are often beyond the scope of management action. When trying to kind of work within the confines of climate optimism, science and technology can still kind of help flip the common doom and gloom scenario or narrative that surrounds climate change. And science and technology kind of can support that mechanisms for maintaining these resources. And to do this, I just wanted to begin with a plug for an article that was led by Craig Pockert and a team of folks specifically on adapting inland fisheries management to a changing climate. And that team identified 3 main components for management of fisheries under climate change. The first being ecological resilience, the second being management resilience, and then the third one being just general monitoring. And when we think of ecological resilience, this being the ability for a system to either absorb or recover from a disturbance. For fisheries managers, that could be trying to maintain size structure diversity or to minimize year class failures or maintain species diversities rather than just focus on a single species with specific management goals. And it's of course important to understand the social context there and how anglers and fishers will respond. When talking about management resilience, this is in thinking about management designed to adapt to a rapidly changing ecological or social conditions. And here many agencies may need to have the capacity to adapt and change their management strategies, but in many other cases, kind of being proactive about how that happens and where it's possible and being flexible to partner with others who may not be kind of their traditional stakeholders and kind of expanding beyond those traditional expectations and management objectives. And this often involves, a large level of outreach and education, as well as co-production of research. And then lastly, in terms of monitoring, this is really to establish essentially baselines for conditions and then also flag potential tipping points and thresholds and system transformations. And I guess the first point I want to make is that, there are existing tools that still work in a fisheries context. So for tribal, state, and federal fish managers, there's an existing array of management practices that can be readily applied to climate change scenarios and situations. And these include things like harvest regulations and stocking and habitat enhancements. And tribal and state and federal fisheries managers have also, a very long history of adapting management to meet emerging threats and climate change just being one of those, such as invasive species being another. And just to run through one quick example related to stocking walleye in Wisconsin. We have a USGS Climate Adaptation Science Center funded project that's aiming to examine projections for self-sustaining and stocked walleye lakes. And by mid-century, we project that about 60 of these currently 250 lakes that are self-sustaining for walleye populations will continue to maintain resilient fisheries, and the remaining lakes will lose their self-sustaining fisheries. And so in order for those lakes to maintain a fishery, they'll have to be supported through stocking. And now we're actually working on a decision support tool, which can help kind of optimize what locations to prioritize in terms of limited resources and stocking allocations given particular climate projections. And then lastly, so in terms of other tools, some of them really do need to be reconsidered in the context of climate change. For example, the concept of place-based conservation and management doesn't really conform very well to climate change expectations, that just as Kelsey was mentioning in terms of sea level rise, the same scenario here. And the static nature of tribal reservations means that, how that fits in, it's very much a place-based practice, and it doesn't really necessarily align with anticipated impacts of climate change on fish or other natural resources. So thinking in terms of range shifts and species moving beyond their kind of historical range and outside of particular boundaries, how can science really help, and how can technology help address these effects in the context of climate change? So there is absolutely still a role for science and technology in this process, but managers need to really consider what role this can play. So when you think about monitoring and experiments and pilot studies, they can help inform active management approaches and also help manage expectations too. So managers and researchers can kind of monitor very key system indicators to help anticipate thresholds or tipping points. They can use experiments to test or confirm or improve understanding of ecological outcomes of climate signals. And they can use pilot studies as proof of concept to demonstrate the efficacy of certain management actions. And all of these really inform active management, which means actually trying to manipulate habitat or translocate and assist migration of species to more suitable habitat, or even put barriers in place to inhibit range expansion of unwanted species. And all of this really translates to managing expectations. So we have to acknowledge that the systems we will face are not necessarily the systems that we have now or the systems that we once had, and understanding that these systems are dynamic and can change provides some level of freedom to think more boldly and consider alternative desired scenarios as well. And in most cases, it's not going to be as simple as science to the rescue, and there are many more confounding social, political, economic, and cultural and legal considerations, as the previous panel members all mentioned, and all of those absolutely take precedent. And I just wanted to end with two figures from a 2020 paper that was led by Dr. Andrea Reed, who's an Indigenous fisheries scientist and the PI for the Center of Indigenous Fisheries at the University of British Columbia. Her article is entitled Two-Eyed Seeing, an Indigenous Framework to Transform Fisheries Research and Management. And this first figure represents 4 different kind of Indigenous conceptual frameworks for promoting knowledge coexistence, and includes the wampum that Kelsey mentioned in her talk as well. And the second diagram kind of details the flow of knowledge, which guides research and management decision. And ultimately there's this third choice here is knowledge coexistence, and it uses a mutual benefit where both Western science and Indigenous knowledge can kind of contribute in parallel to the most advantage. And so for complex problems like climate change, it's really in this space that I think we can optimize our ability to use science and technology to deepen climate change adaptation and resiliency. So with that, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the conversation today. Happy to have any follow-up, but I am looking forward to listening and learning from our other panelists and the participants in the question session.
Great, thank you, Abby. Well, if folks can do a round of applause, if you don't mind, with your reactions for the panelists, and I'll invite the panelists to turn on their cameras, see if I can change, and feel free to put in questions in the chat. I have, I don't know, 6 questions that it's hard to pick which one to start with, but we'll go ahead because I know we won't have time for all of them. But I'll throw it out to whoever wants to answer first. Why is recognizing Indigenous governance and jurisdiction I think a word's missing. So why is it good to recognize Indigenous governance and jurisdiction? Like, why is it beneficial for overall governance, good governance related to water? And if you want to speak to the role of women in that, that's welcome as well.
Well, I can kick us off. I think one thing, and I might start with sort of the latter question about why is it important for women to be involved. I think the obvious reaction is because right now in the dominant sort of Western water regimes, if women are very absent from being sort of the key decision makers and holders of power. We see predominantly sort of white males being in those positions of power to make decisions about how water globally is governed and the types and the ways in which we're able to protect water, to think about responsibility, stewardship, conservation of water globally is still very male dominated, and there's a lot of patriarchy and sort of hegemonic patriarchy that's sort of embedded in the system. So I think to dismantle that means to get more women involved. And I think in a lot of ways, there's so much that the Western world can learn from Indigenous nations in our practice of water governance, which does center women more predominantly, but also recognizing that we've had some challenges in our own communities with dealing with colonization and patriarchy that has also removed a lot of our women from our traditional roles. So, you know, there's some reckoning and reconciling and balancing that needs to happen across all water regimes. But yeah, there just needs to be more women.
I can add to that also. If we think about the statistics of male population to female population and look at how Kelsey's saying that the males are dominated, you're missing out on that much brain power that can come from women that can contribute to the discussion. So even thinking about it from terms of that, and of course, you know, balance is important, but we all have specific responsibilities as women and as men, and being able to bring that into the conversation, I think would really contribute to how water needs to be cared for and how we can acknowledge that water can actually govern itself, but what is our relationship to that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll pick up on that and say, I think that in thinking about Indigenous governance and including roles of women, there's marked difference between sort of what we do now, which we know is not working, to a shift in not only a shift to making decisions in a different way based on different sets of values and principles. So I'm going to say involving women in decision making, involving Indigenous people in decision making, involving Indigenous women in decision making is going to mean that you make decisions differently in terms of process, but it's also going to affect your substance. It's going to affect the values and principles that underlie that decision making. So if we think about good governance, what does that look like? Well, if you've got Indigenous women that are part of that governance, they're going to center children and future generations immediately. And I think that even our Indigenous men can lose sight of that as the core deciding factor, in part because they've always come back to clan mothers and grandmothers to help with that decision making. And they haven't been doing that, or they've been encouraged not to do it in colonial patriarchal contexts. So You know, those reigniting those collaborative frames of governance, including men and women in the governance, but thinking what women bring and what Indigenous people bring into how the decisions are made and on what sets of principles and values can change everything. And I think that that's where environmental evaluation actually has to go. Impact assessment, like we need to start rethinking how we look at decisions that are made for and about environment to be better decisions. And then that, I think, necessarily brings in Indigenous forms of governance into that equation. I like the idea of children being at the center too. I think that's important. And I always, like, I actually often when we're in discussions, we'll say, like, what's at the center of this table? Why are we here? What's the central thing? And I've never had anyone disagree with the well-being of our children and future generations being at the center of that table. So that's a good common starting point, I think.
Thank you. So maybe sort of hearkening to some of what Dr. Kimmer shared earlier today in our lessons from animal relatives, plant relatives, other, and thinking from the perspective of water, how can we consider the spiritness and agency of water in relation to human decision making?
That's a big question. I'll jump in. And I know that others can add to this. One of the things that we do, and I think Sue, you alluded to this when you were speaking about water walks, and you know, I think everyone's kind of getting at this, is we just need to listen to water. And it's connected to what Dr. Kimmer was saying in her talk this morning. How we listen to water, though, the tools by which we can actually engage in those conversations need to be enhanced, and they need to be valued. So as much as I appreciate, you know, two-eyed seeing, I think that that's a second step to thinking about what are Indigenous ways of knowing and seeing the world. And I'll just use a little anecdote. I recently went for a hike with my niece and nephew, and my nephew really wanted to climb up onto this huge rock, and he wanted to climb onto a cedar tree. And I said, you got to be asking for permission if you're going to do those things. And so then he took that very seriously. And it's at one point, you know, looked at his sister and me and said, shh, like, you guys stop talking. I'm waiting for my answer. And he had his little ear up against the rock. And then, you know, he was doing his thing, and then eventually said, okay, yeah, you can start talking. He had his answer. But what's cool is that neither my niece or myself questioned him on what answer he got, how he got it, what did it sound like. It was his answer in his own way. And I think that, you know, that's always been the tension between Indigenous forms of knowledge and Western science, is having to explain Indigenous forms of knowing things into Western science, or have them validated or co-validating. And, you know, we need to think about ways of hearing the water. And like Stu, I know a lot of your work is actually based on listening, right? You described it in your presentation, like listen to what we're being told. And we have the interpretive sets of tools as humans, but we often kind of get that cloud that doesn't allow us to actually perceive the things that we should be seeing, that we're being clearly told by our non-human relatives.
Anyone else want to join in? I know these are all big questions. Conversation.
Yeah, and I think to add to Aimee's is remembering that, you know, we can listen to the water because we are 70% our brain floating in water. We are born through water. We sit inside that lodge of the water, that we can listen to the water. And it doesn't matter who you are. You could be male or female, and being able to look at the essential value that yes, we are all made of water, and yes, we all need water, and working from there to create, I would say, you know, I'm I'm not an expert on wampum at all, but I am aware of the two-row wampum belt. And so there are so many examples that are already out there. It's just a matter of us picking those up and actually applying them to the modern day context.
Yeah, I think there's so many great points there. And that's one of the things that we included in the wampum adaptation framework was a principle of witness, which is really to just be present and to listen and to see all of the things that the natural world is trying to communicate to us. Because sometimes in this sort of modern contemporary world, we don't take the time to do that. And it's really important for us along the Atlantic coast when we're seeing so many natural phenomena like unusual mortality events for right whales, which is sort of too many whales beaching and stranding themselves. We also see fish die-offs happening, not just along the Atlantic, but there's instances of that as well in the Great Lakes with harmful algal blooms. And all of that are our, non-human relatives trying to tell us something about the way in which climatic changes are impacting them, but also then have an impact on us as humans. And so I hope that we can do more of that as a society and as a world, is really just take more time to be able to witness and to allow for those observations of the natural world to inform our decision making for future generations.
Great, thank you. So I think you've started to answer my last question. So we ended about 12:35, and you've all touched on it. But the last question is, how can we promote positive relationships between humans, water, and water relatives? And so what I've just heard sort of very loudly is witness, listen, observe. Is there anything else you would like to share about how we can promote positive relationships, again, between water relatives, and humans?
I think I'll start by just saying what I didn't mention in my previous statements is actually going and connecting with the water. I talk to so many people and they don't actually know where the closest water is to where they live right now. And that could be a puddle, it could be a well, it could be a stream or a river or a lake or ocean. It could even just be, if you're in an arid desert environment, it could be thinking about, when do those rain cycles happen? When is that precipitation coming and visiting you? I just wish that more people connected to water in their daily lives and had greater consciousness about the way in which water comes to visit with them.
Yes, definitely, and some really good points. And to build on that, including tap water. People just turn on the tap and think that water just comes from where? Actually following, where does that water actually come from? I hear a lot of the elders always saying, you need to participate. You need to be there. So to be present, but there are some schools, and I'm pretty sure they're in the Minnesota area, where they actually mapped out the whole system, starting from their fountain inside their school, where that water actually comes from. So they mapped it out on the street and right to the point, the source point where the water actually comes from. So people start to understand that you already have a relationship with water because you drink water, or you make tea, or you boil your potatoes, whatever you do, you do have a relationship with water. It's just changing that narrative to understand what that relationship is, and actually listening to that relationship.
Yeah, I think you're right to build a relationship with water. And I add to that question for when I teach water in the law, where does your water go? Where does your wastewater go, right? And that kind of changes your relationship with water as well, thinking about, how we transform it, how we make it not what it was when it came to us. And I think that's an important dimension to acknowledge. And you're right, Kelsey, develop the relationship, figure out what that relationship is, even a relationship with tears. I had someone to say to me once, I just realized that tears are water. I'm like, yeah, yes, they are, right? And And we need to acknowledge all of those different forms of water as being complementary. And tied to that is this very basic boiled down principle, which is that water is life.
Yeah, and just building on that, I think, I mean, it's such a fundamental concept, water is life, that I think maybe that's why we don't all always recognize it on a regular basis. But yeah, it's like breathing, or, you know, you need water just as much as air, but we don't think about that on a regular basis.
Does anyone want to weave in the question about, I think Kelsey, you sort of got at it a little bit about how we listen for answers about drought or the lack of water. I think Kelsey, you talked about seasonality.
Yes, I think, seasonality is a part of it. Tracking precipitation, when does that rain cycle come in? When are those thunderstorms coming in? But I think it also is, you can connect to understandings of drought and lack of water by also witnessing your, more than human relations and how they are experiencing a lack of water or drought, whether that be a plant species or animal species or otherwise. And I think, too, getting back to what Sue and both Aimee have said in relation to our physical bodies as vessels of water, and how that is a way for us to connect to an understanding of drought and lack of water. We don't have enough time to go into it today, but there are other Indigenous scholars that speak towards our understanding of our fasting. And when you go through a fasting period and the Sundance ceremonies and other types of ceremonies where you really are trying to understand what it is to go without water, and in a lot of ways that physical presence in our immediate bodies can give you a greater understanding of drought and lack of water that is a planetary experience as well.
Well, I don't think I can thank you all enough for sharing and speaking and building upon each other's experience and knowledge today, and sharing that and gifting us all of that today. So if folks can all give a round of applause, really appreciate your time and energy today, and hope folks continue to go on and enjoy the session. Agree, it was beautiful, as Sylvia said. And please fill out the survey on the session if you don't mind. There's a link in the chat. Thank you all. Really appreciate it.